Hello. As Britain mourns the loss of its Queen, the UK's longest-serving monarch, we look back at her life of duty dedicated to the nation and the Commonwealth. She embodied the enduring strength of Britain's monarchy over the last 70 years. What is her legacy, and what is next? Born Princess Elizabeth Alexandra Mary Windsor in Mayfair in central London on the 21st of April 1926. She was the one constant for the nation through conflicts, political and social strife. She was crowned monarch of Britain's global empire at the age of 25. And while the empire has diminished, until the very end, she was determined by a sense of duty to welcome her 15th Prime Minister, Liz Truss, just 2 days before she died. And as the international tributes pour in, a reminder that the Queen had met every US president, bar one, since Harry Truman. That is over a period which covers nearly 30% of American history. Along a fascinating life, let's discuss it. With me in the studio, the historian Lee Rotherham. We then go to Richard Fitzwilliams, the royal commentator. Say hello once again to Anna Whitelock, Professor of the History of Monarchy at City University London and Director of the Centre for the Study of Modern Monarchy. And we go to Malta, to Kapara to be precise. And there we see Simon Cousins, a colonial-era historian who met the Queen in 2005, Malta being an island that she was very, very attached to. Simon, we'll talk to you in a moment about the kind of reception Her Majesty got, because it was there in 2015 that she and Prince Philip performed their last overseas trip. So it really did hold a special place for her. Bear with me while we talk about other things first. Richard, let me come to you. It wasn't just the fact that she reigned for 70 years. There was something that made her very different. What was it?
Well, it was far more than just the length of her reign. It was her dedication to duty. It was the way she nurtured the Commonwealth. It was also her empathy. The best example I can think of, and I mean this is comparatively recent and it shows how adaptable she was, and that was at the beginning of the pandemic, speaking to the nation where so many were deeply worried and deeply troubled, and quoting Britain's wartime sweetheart, Dame Vera Lynn, and saying, "We will meet again." And people knew, of course, that she had been there, as subsequently the broadcast of the 75th anniversary of VE Day showed, and her experience from the first royal duty that she undertook in 1942, when her father, George VI, made her Colonel of the Grenadier Guards. She has conducted her reign in an exemplary way. What 21, the famous pledge that she made in Cape Town, and subsequently, of course, constitutionally, the perfect monarch. Growing up, admittedly, in an age of difference and never giving an interview, but on the other hand, even though we didn't know what she thought of important issues of the day, we did know, as prime ministers always found out, she was always keen to listen, always also keen on the Commonwealth. So whereas it could be argued that Britain had lost an empire and not found a role going into the EEC, later EU, and then out of it with Brexit, it could also be argued that the Queen was the one constant we had in a time of absolutely seismic change. And also we must pay tribute to Prince Philip, because it was the partnership between the two of them, I think, that was so extraordinarily productive, very different in temperament, and yet so mutually supportive. And she was somebody who was deeply religious in a secular age, but I think that gave her strength too, and people loved her. One bears in mind Elizabeth I's famous golden speech though God hath raised me high, I bear the glory of my crown that I have reigned with your love. Well, that is what the people felt about the Queen.
Richard, you reference her duty, her dedication, and that speech in South Africa. Here's a little bit from it.
I declare before you all that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service and to the service of our great imperial family to which we all belong.
Lee, that underlines how serious she was about the role that she one day would inherit. She was, of course, then was just a princess, just a princess. But I was talking to somebody this morning, a friend of mine who lives in Ireland, and this really struck me. He said that he was in a largely Republican hostelry last night when news came through that the Queen had died. And it all went absolutely silent. And then they all raised their glasses and said, God bless the Queen, because they felt that she was the one that had helped to bring peace to Ireland. These were Republicans. Was she something to all people?
I think she brought something to all people. I mean, we just heard her extraordinary personal qualities, which were missing in some of her predecessors historically, I think we can safely say. Part of the way that she managed the transition of monarchy from the 50s to the modern era, it was a very long period, was this whole business of managing the magic getting inside or possibly even conversely, the magic getting outside, and just leaving enough of that mystery in order for on the one hand, the authority and the majesty of the role to retain its ancient luster, while on the other hand, having that degree of connectivity and with the individual, with the normal person. It's a very difficult balancing act to do. We've seen difficulties with how the Spanish have done it with Juan Carlos in recent years. The Scandinavians and the Dutch have done it in a much more casual way. So to actually do it with the UK and to achieve that delivery of change over what have been quite tempestuous political times.
Anna, let me ask you, beg your pardon. Anna, let me ask you this, because one of your titles is an expert in the modern monarchy. Was she in any way a representative of the old age, or did she very cleverly bridge the gap between ancient and modern?
I think that's exactly it. And that, I think, is probably her greatest achievement, that she managed to maintain, support, popularity and a sense of sort of relevance for the monarchy, which, of course, is this age-old anachronistic institution built on privilege, not on merit, about birthright. It's not inclusive. It's everything at odds with the age. But somehow she managed to maintain its place in modern Britain. And she herself had a kind of medieval-like monarchical quality of sort of elusive charisma. She maintained the mystique, the magic of monarchy somehow, the reverence for the royal body, the sense of not touching the body of the Queen. These were all very age-old kind of notions. But she somehow managed to preserve that mystique of monarchy in the full glare of a modern media. And in fact, the monarchy that has emerged over the course of her reign is one that is underpinned by this relationship with the media. That is absolutely central to the relationship and the brand now of monarchy. It's a relationship with the media. And of course, that relationship was cast in many ways by Prince Philip II, with the coronation of the Queen being televised for the first time. So, yes, she's been ushering in a kind of change, but very gentle change. But I think more than that, maintaining the mystique of centuries-old monarchy in modern Britain. And I think that sort of conundrum that somehow she's managed to maintain so successfully is actually quite remarkable. And I think it's going to be an incredibly difficult feat for the new King Charles.
Perhaps she managed, it's strange to say that, to maintain that elusiveness, if you like, because of her motto, never complain, never explain. Simon, I'm going to bring you in. Early days of her marriage to Prince Philip, who's already been described as her rock. 1949 to 1951, he was a naval officer. They lived together, their only overseas residence ever as a couple on Malta, an extraordinary house called Villa Guardamangia, which has now been bought by the government of Malta for the nation. As a colonial historian, what was her relationship with Malta? Because at that time, of course, she was a princess, not yet a queen, and yet she kept going back.
Yes, as you rightly say, she spent some time here, she lived here. And she lived here as the metaphorical fairy tale princess before the weight of her professional duties. She always referred to Malta as the Isle of Happy Memories. She spent her 24th birthday here. She spent one Christmas here. And rumors abound whether Prince Charles was actually conceived here as well. So every time Her Majesty used to mention Malta, you could detect a certain fondness and affection, no doubt.
You mention Prince Charles, of course, now King Charles. There is a famous photograph of Prince Philip and Princess Elizabeth, as she was then, on a bench at the Villa Guardamangia, where he has two fingers placed down the side of the bench, which many speculated meant that there may well be a second royal child. And lo and behold, just 6 months later, we had Princess Anne. It was a cheeky time. It was an opportunity for them really to relax, wasn't it?
Yes, Malta undoubtedly left its mark on Her Majesty. She was very fond of Maltese oranges, and I know that offline, well behind officialdom, she used to receive every now and again a consignment of her favorite Malta oranges. There was a reaction, always a positive reaction, whenever she received letters from Malta. You know, she was a wonderful lady for us Maltese. She will always be the queen of Maltese hearts. Let's not forget, she was our sovereign. She was our last queen. Until the early 70s, she was still head of state. So we have to come to terms with the loss. We're a very proud, sovereign, independent nation, but there is something missing. She's taken a piece of our hearts with her, no doubt.
And as we hear the clock chiming in the background, we are reminded of time passing. Simon, I'll come back to you in a little while to talk about 2005, when you met the Queen, 2015, her last official engagement overseas, Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting. But I'm going to talk about family now. And I'm going to ask you to talk about family, and we're going to play in a very famous clip from Her Majesty the Queen from 1992.
1992 is not a year on which I shall look back with undiluted pleasure. In the words of one of my more sympathetic correspondents, it has turned out to be an annus horribilis.
She was referring there not only to the fire at Windsor Castle, one of her favourite residences, but to the fact that the marriage of three of her children, or the marriages of three of her children, had broken up. It was a terrible year, an annus horribilis. How did she cope with the fact that there was personal turmoil, always, it seemed, in some sense, to set aside or to set alongside national duty?
It's a good question. We don't really know the answer because we were never privy to that kind of insight. But I suppose you could look at it this way, that it just demonstrated the nature of the changing society itself, which she was, and the length of the reign, that having come to the throne as a result of her father and his brother and a divorcee and a wedding problem, that as a mark of the society that she was in that by that stage, which was a high, it has become a society of high levels of divorce. And of course, that her own family reflected the broader events of what's going on in society as a whole.
Richard, what would you say were the most difficult personal times for her?
Oh, I think there is no doubt that obviously the death of her strength and stay, Prince Philip, but of course his innings, so to speak, of '99 he was wonderfully supportive of her. Clearly, you're looking at the 1990s, because if ever there was a decade when things had gone wrong for the royal family, one thing after another, and most particularly the War of the Waleses, obviously the Winds of Fire, and then certainly the initial response to the tragedy of Diana's death, it was a decade which was unutterably awful. There were one or two moments, visit to South Africa in 1995 and Britannia to welcome in the democracy for Nelson Mandela, but it was one of these ghastly decades because the annus horribilis, which, after all, we had the circumstance where Charles and Diana were quite literally at war. There was the terrifying experience of, because the princess was superb at PR, of seeing her in front of the Taj Mahal and he wasn't there. And of course, the visit to Korea, that put paid to any idea that there might be a couple and coexist in a separate way, as John Major implied when they separated.
But let me ask you this, sorry about that. Do you think she ever let out the private anguish she felt, other than in a statement, oh, it's not been a good year, it's been a horrible year? Did she ever let it be known that she was hurting inside?
Oh, absolutely not. The way she handled it in the Christmas broadcast in 1992, yes, there is another reference to the annus horribilis. But in fact, it's not the way she believed that you could separate the public and the private, I think, although the private had become so public. The Morton book, the Dimbleby interview and the admission of adultery, the Dimbleby book, where Charles said that she was cold and distant, or certainly Duke of Edinburgh was, and then also the Panorama interview, duplicitously obtained, as we know now. But all of these were shocking at that time, and of course pretty unprecedented.
Absolutely.
Much as the Oprah interview was unprecedented. That's the other period you mentioned. One has to mention the last 2.5 years, because with Andrew's disgrace and clearly with the Sussexes stepping down as senior working royals and then feeling as bitter as they have, the Oprah interview did so much damage, especially when it came to the young and persons of colour. If you look at the polls otherwise overwhelmingly favourable.
But we're talking about the institution of monarchy there, rather than the Queen individually, if I may say. And I want to just talk about Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II's character and how she was assessed. Anna, let me come to you. Was it right, given what we know about the private anguish she probably felt, that she came across at times, perhaps, as cold and unemotional, like following the death of Princess Diana? She was accused of that.
She certainly was accused of that at the time, and it was actually a really profound moment where it seemed like the Queen was at odds with her people. The newspapers were calling for the Queen to return to London. But in fact, the Queen, I think, was acting, first of all, as a grandmother. She was tending to her young grandsons who had just lost their mother. But she was also following a kind of age-old mourning practice of the monarchy to withdraw, actually, at a time of mourning. And of course, that sort of ancient royal custom and expectation became at odds with society, which was looking for an expression of grief. And of course, we remember the somewhat hysterical reactions of people gathered in Kensington Palace and so on at the death of Diana. And it felt that the Queen's stiff upper lip, partly a product of her generation, partly her product of her being monarch, seemed really at odds with the people who were looking for a much more expressive declaration of grief and loss.
But was she cold? Was she cold, or was she aloof?
No, but I don't think by any account she was. I think she had a very strong sense of humour. I think she was warm. I think the very fact that people who saw her actually felt they actually met her goes a long way to explain that, a real sense that actually she was so warm, her eyes were sparkly. So no, I don't think she was cold. I think she was a product of a different age. And I also think she was very much in this dual role as woman, as mother, as sister, as grandmother, and great-grandmother, as well as the boss of the firm and the important role of keeping that particular show on the road through choppy waters at times.
Well, Anna, there you are talking about some public perception, perhaps that she was a little bit cold, but also referencing her fun side. And Simon, we're going to talk to you in just a moment after we see her with that extraordinary twinkle in her eye, which she demonstrated when she was introduced to her new Prime Minister just the other day. You could see it. She was smiling, she was happy, but not quite as much as she was when she was with a very famous bear.
You would like a marmalade sandwich? I always keep one for emergencies.
So do I. I keep mine in here.
Absolutely extraordinary. When you met her in 2005, what impression did you get of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II? Was she somebody who was having fun? Was she somebody who put you at ease? Sorry, you tell me.
Well, first impressions, I didn't expect her to be so small. I couldn't believe how small and petite Her Majesty actually was. And I kind of held myself a bit back from having to crouch and look down to listen to her and speak to her. And then the second surprise was what she said to me. I expected a rather formal comment, and I was there in a U-shaped almost circle with a number of other people. And if this was in connection with a war veteran event. And her opening words were something like, so what did you do then? And it really wasn't the line I was expecting.
Was she suggesting with a bit of a giggle that you looked a little bit too young to have served with these war veterans, or what?
Well, I was standing next to a 1942 veteran, so there was a great disparity in age. What I can tell you is, as she moved on to the next person, I slid my hand in the jacket pocket to take out my camera, and you wouldn't believe, I don't know where they sprung out from, but it was a bit like a James Bond movie, and all of a sudden these inconspicuous security men, one of them was half my size, almost lunged at me until he figured it was just a camera. And I was like, hey, camera, you know. So it was a roller coaster of emotions. You think you were prepared for it, and Her Majesty just casually got on with her curiosities and
10 years
very
later,
down-to-earth questions.
10 years later, the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, last official overseas trip by Her Majesty. Did you notice any diminution either in her enthusiasm or her ability to move around? How was she then?
Well, she was very much the same. She always felt very good here. And even though 2015 was her last visit, she actually found the time this year, last April, to write formally to our government, reflecting on the 80th anniversary of the George Cross, which
was awarded to the entire island, I must remind you.
Which was her father's award, and she shared the same passion for the wartime Maltese as her father did. And we still have the George Cross very proudly flapping in the Mistral wind on all the Maltese flags. So although it was in a way an imposition during colonial rule, the Maltese on independence decided to keep the George Cross there on the flag where it's been ever since.
Let me read this out now from the Financial Times on the morning after her death. This is about empire, and it goes, if the reigns of the other great female monarchs of English and British history, Elizabeth I and Victoria, coincided with periods of national expansion, it fell to the second Elizabeth to be a mainstay of a nation coming to terms with a changed place in the world. Did she, Lee, perhaps have to come to terms with a reduced role in the world in terms of importance as a British monarch, or did she actually embellish the role of the British sovereign overseas?
I think you can certainly justify saying the latter in terms of being very much at the heart of the development, of the transition and development of the Commonwealth. I mean, as a historian, I would challenge the issue about Elizabeth I purely from the historical basis of rescinding the return
I'll let
of
you
Calais.
take that up with the Financial
but
Times.
please do. I mean, amongst many other issues I take up with them. Look, we're talking about a period of 6 decades of rule, of reign, during which the world changed and society changed. People got wealthier. Technology has advanced massively. Globally, the world has changed in all manner of ways. There is no longer a Soviet Union. There is empires have fallen. The world changes as it always has changed, and her success has been very much as the guide at the tiller, helping guide the ship of state through those turbulent waters.
And how was she able to do that? Because
by experience, I would say.
She had nobody above her who could tell her how to do it.
Yes, it's very much. This is one of these roles which is very much having to pick it up on the job. I mean, obviously, our world correspondent, illustrious correspondent, will have more of an understanding of her relationship with her father, who of course was lost far too early. So there wasn't that same degree
well, he's
of
only just past his middle 50s.
Well, indeed,
and
of course she was in
96.
She was in her mid-20s when she took up the role. So
Can
there
I
wasn't
ask
much of that time to bed in.
Richard, she must have learnt a lot from her father, obviously, before she became the Queen. But I want to ask you, were there anybody else that she looked up to in life who taught her valuable life lessons and monarchical lessons, if you like? And also whether you think when she died, she was able to be satisfied with her life.
Yes, I do, because I think that there was a great deal of affection for her, not only in Britain and the Commonwealth, but worldwide. Indeed, one of the greatest monarchs that we've ever had, and the monarchy goes back over 1,000 years. And also her legacy, the way she nurtured the Commonwealth, if one looks for a particular incident where she will always be remembered, and that was obviously the state visit to Ireland in 2011, which was so brilliantly handled. But she handled her constitutional duties perfectly. She was a mother, yes, indeed. Her family had difficulties from time to time, but there's no doubt that as an exemplar of someone whose sense of duty was second to none, she will never be forgotten, and her reign may not have a parallel in that. Also, there was a cultural renaissance too. Society was opening up, it was more liberal, it was changing. She was one constant, a constant on whom everyone could always rely.
Richard, thank you very much indeed. Simon, for your thoughts from Malta, we are very grateful indeed. And Lee, much appreciated. It is sad, so sad for many, for those of us who've known nobody else as our sovereign, but it was in a way the perfect ending. No long illness, smiling and doing her duty just 2 days before she died. And for simply being there for so long, may I say thank you.